I'm Rick Harp. This is your APTN News Brief for Thursday, February 15th. We're learning more about the Manitoba man recently charged with killing 5 members of his family. And as we'll hear from reporter Tamara Pimentel, things reached a point for the man where a judge warned him to seek help before his life spiraled out of control.
Ryan Manakisik of Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba faces 5 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of his common-law partner, Amanda Clearwater, her 17-year-old niece, Maya Lee Grattan, and their children, 6-year-old Bethany, 4-year-old Javen, and 2.5-month-old Isabella Manakisik. He has a record. 3 years ago, Manakisik was warned by a provincial court judge that he needed help with his methamphetamine addiction. Manakisik was convicted of mischief that time and sentenced to 18 months probation. Court heard he had locked himself in a garage in Winnipeg, was delirious, and damaged the door. He was treated for psychosis, and the next day he went to a coffee shop in Winnipeg where he threw glass mugs, causing them to shatter. Employees locked themselves in a back room and called 911. Manakisik was charged again in 2021 for impaired driving. On Sunday, RCMP found Clearwater's body in a ditch near Carman. Hours later, they were called to a vehicle fire on a highway near St. Eustache, west of Winnipeg. Officers say Manakisik pulled his 3 children out of the vehicle, but they were all pronounced dead at the scene. Grattan's body was later found at their home in Carman. In an obituary, a thank you went out to the Manitoba community for standing behind the family during this devastating time. Manakisik is set to appear in court on the murder charges on February 23rd. He remains in custody, and the charges have not been tested in court. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Quebec, the only jurisdictions to not have missing persons legislation in Canada, something called for by the MMIWG inquiry. Kayak Robinson was a commissioner with that inquiry. She wished NWT had such a law, one that may have benefited the family of Frank Rubin, a Fort Smith man who went missing 9 months ago.
Hard. Getting up every day, not knowing where your son is. So I just want to get the message out there. If anyone has any information, please come forward.
I hope that the Grubin family is getting the support that they need, and that they are not being left alone to navigate these issues. Like, these are complex legal issues. In terms of the need for missing persons legislation, specifically call for Justice 5.8, it's very sad to me that that is something that has not been prioritized, that it's not something that has been implemented. That's concerning. That means the families of 80 people who are left with heartbreak in question. It's also not the most complicated legislation. There are examples of it in very effective functioning models throughout the country, and Ontario as having developed quite robust legislation in this area. I would also look to the Yukon for how they've developed and also co-developed their legislation with stakeholders, and particularly Indigenous communities and grassroots.
To Vancouver, where thousands took to the streets this Valentine's Day to demand answers and justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Tina House was there.
We're here on the downtown east side of Vancouver at the 33rd Annual March for the Murdered or Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. Joining me today is Angela Marie McDougall. Angela, you are the Executive Director of the Battered Women's Support Services. Tell me how this march began.
This march began with the brutal killing of Cheryl Anjou in 1992 as a way to honor her memory and to make visible her killing, and a way for families to grieve. One of the things that we started to see after the killing of Cheryl Anjou was an increase in missing and murdered women here from this neighborhood, and the disappearances, and women were killed. And so we know that there were at least 3 serial killers that were operating in this neighborhood through the 1990s, and that one of them we know has got a bit more attention, but there were at least three serial killers at the time. So the march has been really important way to make visible, but also to to mourn and to seek justice. And it's been a vital way for community to organize.
There are actually thousands of people joining us today that are in the march. Family members, advocates, community supporters. What do you want to say to the public about how important it is to know about this issue?
Well, it's so important, and particularly because we know that Indigenous women have been leading this effort for years and making visible the disappearances and the killings. And so the honoring of the memories of and the spirits of women who have passed and to recognize those that are missing has been so important. It's a way to heal. It's also a way for families to speak out. And it's been a galvanizing march, one of the unique organizing efforts that probably is unique around the world. I don't think there's anything like it that's lasted for 33 years to draw attention to such a huge social issue. And we continue to seek justice.
The James Smith Cree Nation in Saskatchewan has unveiled a new emergency alert system. And as Rachel May reports, the intent is to avoid incidents like 2022's fatal mass stabbing spree.
2 weeks ago, the inquest into the mass stabbings on James Smith Cree Nation and the nearby village of Weldon wrapped up. The inquest was held to provide recommendations to prevent similar deaths from happening in the future, with 29 recommendations made from the jury and the presiding coroner. One of the recommendations was for RCMP and James Smith to implement a public safety strategy. A new app will allow Indigenous communities across Saskatchewan to send out emergency alerts to their communities as events are unfolding. The first alerts app will be incorporated into an existing app called the Talking Stick. It provides Indigenous people with peer support 24/7. The app has been approved by Apple to have an alert designation, which means that notifications can be sent out despite phones being on silent or in airplane mode. As the app is not connected to the provincial emergency alert system, the alerts will be able to go out ahead of RCMP alerts, provided individuals have the app downloaded. The app is now available for all First Nations across Saskatchewan. Rachel May, APTN National News, James Smith Cree Nation.
And finally, Algonquin First Nations from Quebec have voiced their opposition to plans for a radioactive dump on their territory. Last week, the Kebawik First Nation filed a federal court application for a judicial review of the facility's approval. And as Annette Francis reports, their cause has attracted support from members of the Bloc Québécois and the Green Party.
Chiefs, community members, and allies of the Algonquin nations in Quebec gathered with signs and drums for a small rally on Parliament. They united in opposition of a radioactive disposal facility at Chalk River. Sasha Hybricks came to show her support. She works with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. She said it's important to put a halt on the project to find a safer solution.
I think the best option would be the deep geological reservoir that they've done in other countries, such as like Finland and Sweden, where you really you bury the waste deep underground, far away from water sources that are important for the Indigenous communities and all of the local communities.
The vice chief of Temiskaming First Nation is pleased with the support, but says more people should be concerned about the issue.
This water is going to affect everybody, not just us, but everybody in the 7 generations down the line. So we would really like to have maybe a little more support coming from our neighboring non-Indigenous communities.
Last month, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, gave the green light for the Chalk River nuclear facility to build a place to dispose of 1 million cubic meters of low-level radioactive waste, such as contaminated clothing and building materials. However, it is located 1 kilometer from the Ottawa River. Before the rally, chiefs and politicians held a press conference in Parliament. Chief Lance Haymond of the Kebawik First Nations said the Ottawa River holds immense cultural, spiritual, and historical importance to the Anishinaabe people. It runs through unceded ancestral lands on which their nations hold title and rights.
Last week's decision by the Supreme Court in C-92 reminded everyone that First Nations have ancestral rights protected by the Constitution, including the inherent right to self-government. So it's as a chief of a government that I present myself here to ask the current federal government, nation to nation, to step in and stop the nonsense decision made by the CNSC.
Green Party co-leader Elizabeth May stood in support of the chief's calls for a halt. She said the CNSC is once again rubber stamping a project.
So we have a situation again where the words are really clear. Say them again: free, prior, and informed consent. The word prior is very important here because, as you've heard, the Indigenous peoples of the area were not consulted about the location of the site.
The Chalk River facility is expected to last 550 years, but the chiefs say they'll continue to fight to stop the development until they've been consulted and a better plan for storage is in place. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
And that's your APTN News Brief for Thursday, February 15th. I'm Rick Harp.